Hey everyone, and welcome to another Into the Terminal. Today we're going to be talking about the top 5 user management tasks for Linux. So why don't we jump right onto the terminal and get going? So I
Those
think
users,
Nate, what
I said those users, Scott, they're a problem.
they are, they are the worst. But unfortunately,
Mine
they keep us employed.
in the first minute of the show. That's what I'm here for. All right, what are you doing,
So
Scott?
I think the first thing we need to talk about when we talk about users is putting them on the system. So when we're creating a new user account, we're going to use useradd. And today our user is going to be Frank. But at this point, Frank can't log into the system yet because he does not yet have a password. So we also need to set the initial password for Frank using the password command. And notice that it complained about the password. That's totally normal because as the administrative user, I can do whatever I want, including setting bad passwords for people. But Frank would have to actually choose something that was within our password policy.
Yeah, yeah. This is a
Nate,
temporary password. It's probably something super simple, like January 2023, right, or something.
something. And then something else that we might want to do is, Nate, what else might we want to do this user?
So let's assume that maybe this is like the first user that you're adding to the system, and that user might need super user access. You don't want to just give them root access. Just that's the old way. Give them the root password. Sorry, there's an announcement coming through my thing. I didn't mute it. We're off to a good start, Scott. All right. So what you would do is set them up with sudo access. We have a previous episode which was totally like well put together and not a train wreck that you can go watch about sudo rules and whatnot. But in this case, we're just going to add them to the wheel group because by default, the wheel group grants sudo access to anything on the system. And there's probably a dozen ways to add someone to a group. Scott's showing us usermod. There's also group mems, or you can like edit Etsy groups, which is always fun.
Right. And so the options that we're using for user mod here is that we're going to append a group definition of wheel group to the Frank user. And how would we test this out, Nate?
You can test it out by SUing over to Frank. SU is switch user, right? And then you can try to do a sudo something or other, like sudo ls or sudo cat Etsy password or Etsy group or Etsy shadow, which you shouldn't have access to.
That I like that one.
Put in Frank's super secure password. There you go.
Good thing I remembered it from when I said it earlier. Whew.
Yeah. Like, oh crap, what did I set it to? It's probably Red Hat.
All right.
All
So
right,
that's
so we've successfully made an insecure user with a bad password and gave him root access. We're done.
uh, let's say anyway. We added a new user to our system. We set their initial password, which we'll actually be talking later about how you can um, make someone change their password upon their first use of it. And then this person happened to need super user access to the machine, so we added them to the wheel group, which is automatically defined in Red Hat Enterprise Linux to have root authority for commands on the system. So after the transition, we're going to be talking about the other 4 most common tasks. I guess there are 3 more most common tasks. We talked about adding sudo access. That was our second task. So we're going to be talking about disabling a user, right? So what happens when Frank leaves? Um, we're also going to be talking about setting or changing someone's password. I don't know about you, Nate, but I constantly get people that are like, "Oh, I forgot my password. Can you reset it?"
Yep.
And then the last one that we're going to talk about is setting up shared file areas for groups to work on.
That can
So that's a
sometimes
little,
be a tricky one, but
yeah.
common, right? Common, at least common on a like a shell server, a machine where you're going to have or a file share.
Uh, Yeah, I mean, it applies to any kind of file share. Uh, I actually did this on um, a system recently where we were sharing things with a bunch of people who were mounting it from their Windows system. So setting this kind of stuff up is pretty normal. So stay with us. Don't forget, if you like this content, hit that like button. If you want to see more like this or be notified when we are doing these things, smash that subscribe. And if you think somebody would be interested in this, share it with them using the share button. Stay with us.
But if they smash it, won't the next user not be able to click it anymore? Gently press it. Don't break it.
All right. I like smashing the subscribe button, Nate. I consequently, I don't know if it's related, but I go through like 7 mice a year.
Because you smash too many buttons?
I mean,
Maybe you just need to buy better mice.
I mean, not all of us have dainty clicks like Nate Lager.
Yeah. Maybe I just value my investment in this nice ergonomic mouse that I use. Anyway, I think we had a show that we were gonna like talk about user management and stuff in.
Yeah. So you're going
All
to
right.
talk to
So,
us about
yeah. So
disabling.
we made that Frank user and we gave him a really bad password, and we told him to change it, and he's refusing to change it. So now we're going to lock him so that so that our system is no longer secure, no longer insecure, right? So there's a couple ways to lock users. We're going to talk about a handful. If you know of more, feel free to put them in the chat because I'm sure, just like with everything in Linux, there's like 128 ways to get it done. So the first one is with usermod. You can lock an account. So there's a flag for usermod. You can either use dash dash lock or dash capital L, and then the username, and boom, it'll lock Frank. Now, you might think lock means that the account is completely locked out. Actually, what this means is it's locked his password. So if Frank was logging in with a password, then Frank will no longer be able to log in. But if Frank was logging in with, you notice it just puts the bang before the old string. I noticed this when I was testing it earlier. So if you unlock him with dash capital U, then it just takes the bang back out and his password's back to where it was, right? But a caveat you want to be aware of is this locks his password, not his account. So if he's logging in some way that does not require a password, like an SSH key, it may still let him into the system. So you may have to take further steps to make sure that Frank is, in fact, not able to log in. And one of those, well, there's two ways to get that done. One of them is also a usermod command where you can set Frank's shell to a shell that prevents login. It's just usermod -s or -- shell, and then the name of the shell, which is sbin no login, which is a special shell that just prevents login, and then of course the user ID, Frank. Now, if you were to look at Etsy password, you'll see his shell is sbin no login. Now, if Frank tried to log in, I forget if it gives him a message that says he can't log in or if it just throws him out, but it won't let him log in. So that's another way. So you could do it that way. You can lock the password and set no login, or you can just set no login. There may be things that Frank can still do that don't require a shell. I don't know. Is there a way around sbin no login? Are you aware of any, Scott? I forget if
Um,
there's like
there's things like web applications will sometimes look at a user's password set on the machine, or maybe they're using something like HT password, which is
right,
completely independent of the Unix
right.
and user model. So there's like other things that this person may have access to on the system depending on what it's doing or how their authentication to the system has been configured. Um, one of the things that we haven't talked about is centralized user management, right? So here
Right.
we're addressing a user on an individual box, which is pretty common for a small deployment. But if you have like 10,000 employees in your company, typically that's not how you would manage user accounts. You'd have something like
Right.
a central user repository.
Could be
Um,
AD, could be IDM, could be lots of things. LDAP. I worked at a place where all identity went through a plain old LDAP server. it was
and
it was
so
interesting.
there you would make changes at the central
Right.
authentication resource, and then that would propagate out to all the machines because they're not doing individual user management on the machines.
Right. Right. But so there is one more way to get this done, and I think this is actually probably the most complete approach, which is to expire the account. So you can set temporary access using chage, chage. So you could say, like, this person only has access for 3 months, right? But you can also use chage to say this person's expired, right? So chage -e sets the expiration date, and 0 says to set it to the absolute oldest, which is like what, Unix epoch, 1970, 1969, whatever that is. But you can also set it to a date. It could be any date in the past, right? And that'll also get the same thing done. Or you can say it expires Friday if Frank is being fired, for example. Right? Now, once you do that, if you do a chage-i on Frank, it should give you his information, and it'll show you he expired back in 1970.
Yeah, I think you went change dash L.
Oh, is it dash L? Sorry, typo in the. You're right. There you go. There you go. January 1st, 1970. So again, you could have set that to like last Friday or just yesterday, right? And it would have gotten the same thing done. It's just 0 is a lot easier to type than a whole date. So
Yeah,
there you
and
go. 3 ways to lock an account or disable an account in Linux.
excellent. And now I need to re-enable him because, of course, we're going to be doing more stuff with Frank.
Oh,
So planning for success.
yeah, yeah. It's a good thing when one demo locks the account that you're going to use in the next one.
Sorry, not change. I want user
We
mod.
did no login on him. We got to set it back to bin bash and unlock his account.
Oh, interesting.
See, I didn't know CHSH was even a thing. I guess it's not anymore.
It's probably some like antiquated thing because I'm old.
Bin bash. There you go, Frank. Yay.
Let's just double check.
Make sure Frank works. Cool.
All right. So thanks for that. Yeah, like disabling users is a pretty common thing. People leave, people transfer departments. Like, yeah. So that's something that should be regularly occurring. If it's not,
Yeah, right. And everybody, these are all, by the way, non-destructive ways. You could just delete the user if they are leaving. However, if they come back or if you still need access to their home directory, the account would be gone. So would the home directory if you deleted them. Unless you told it not to delete the home directory, but that's just a great way to leave cruft in your home in your home file system. So you could just do a user del and boom, he's gone. That's better than locked. It's gone.
well, and honestly, that's something that you should think about, and maybe your department should have a policy on how you're going to do this.
Right.
Personally, in the places that I work, um, removing someone's content is not always the go-to because you may need that content later. So disabling a user and keeping their content in place for a while, and then you back up that content somewhere so you can recreate it if you need to,
Right.
and then remove the user off of the system. That's how we've done it in the past. All right. So our next.
Rick mentions that user could have been running important cron jobs, and I said that never happens.
Oh yeah, that never happens. Us relying on someone doing something, never. All right. The fourth most common user task. Hey, I've forgotten my password. Can you reset it? So
Right.
they're doing this. We could use the password command like we did earlier on Frank, where we type it in and type it in again. But that's kind of annoying because now you have to type it twice. So what I like doing is using an option for the password command. So I use echo to print a statement like, right? So it just prints out what's in quotes there. And then I take that thing and instead of printing it to the screen, I pipe it into Frank's uh, account. And so now we have overwritten his previous password with secret password. And then it went through all of the normal um, hashing and other encrypted passwordy things that happen. So now this is Frank's password. I can go, hey, Frank, I've reset your password. You can log in using secret password. But wait, is that really what we want?
Well, now you know his password. Not only did you set it to a not great password, you could have set it to an awesome password and given it to him, but now you know his password, and that's probably not great.
Right. And then the other thing is, Frank just forgot his password and I set it to something simple. Why wouldn't he just keep using that horrible password that's easy to
Right.
remember?
Right.
So the other piece of this that I like to do is I like to make this a temporary password. So the first time Frank uses it, he'll be asked to change it immediately. So for that, we're going to use our friend chage. I'm just going to do a chage-d0. And what chage-d0 does is it sets the date of last password change to, instead of an actual date, 0. And that's a special value that tells the system that when Frank logs in, we need to immediately launch him into a password change dialog.
Right.
And we can see that with a chage-l on Frank to list his properties. There you go.
Password
Password
must
must
be
be changed.
changed. There you go.
Yep.
It's pretty obvious too. Password must be changed. Password must be changed. Password must be changed.
Yeah. The way that we track these different properties, so the date of last password change is an actual number of days that have lapsed since January 1st, 1970, which I set to 0. That was actually what I set to 0. But the other things
Right.
like password expires, password inactive, those are calculated off of the date of last password change. So if I want my password to expire every 30 days, or after it expires, they get like 7 days where they could still log in with it, but they'll be forced to change it. That's the inactive period.
Mm-hmm.
Those are just a number of days. And then we use the date of last password change plus 30 days to figure out the password expiry, or the password change plus the password expiry plus the account inactive to figure out when they can no longer use that password. Um, so that's why all three are set to that, because the thing that's the basis of all those calculations has been set to 0.
Right. Now, is this how you would normally enforce password policy as well, or is there another mechanism for that that I'm not thinking of?
Oh, well,
I don't mean policy like complexity. I mean policy like must be changed every 3 months. That sort of policy.
ah, so I think we'd want to look at login.defs where we can
Okay.
set parameters. You're taking me off script, Nate. What could possibly go wrong?
It was just a question. You didn't have to make up a new demo.
Um, so login def sets the default things for a login that's added to the system. And I'm pretty sure those are in there somewhere.
Yeah, the only environment I've worked in where password policy was important was the one that was using that LDAP backend. So we didn't do any of it on the Linux side. We did it all on the LDAP side. There we go.
Yeah, so this is the maximum days someone can keep a password. So if I wanted it to expire every 30 days, I'd change this value to 30. Um, Pass warn age, that's in advance of the password expiring. How when they log in, I'll show a message that says, "Hey, your password's about to expire in whatever date." And then the passmin days, this is how many days they must keep a password before they can change it again.
Right.
And that's actually I like to call that the Greg McBrien rule, because that's my dad, Greg McBrien. Um, because he used to do things like, "Oh, you want me to change my password, but I don't really want to change my password. Oh, you remember my last 7 passwords? Well, that's cool. I'll just change it, change it, change it, change it, change it, change it, and my 7th change will be what it was originally." Um, and so with the minimum days, you actually force them to keep it a certain period of time before you allow them to change it again.
Right. Which just makes it too much of a hassle to do the change dance. Yeah.
Exactly.
By the time
Exactly.
they get it back to where they want it, it's expired again.
Exactly.
So
Oh,
I see something else on this screen that's going to be relevant in our next demo. Right up
oh,
there, umask.
oh, yeah, the umask. Yeah, so maybe we'll return to that when we cover our next demo.
Yep.
All right. So login defs is also where we can like change a whole bunch of different things, but it's only used when you create a new user, right? So that very first time when we did useradd on Frank, that's where he got all those definitions for his account settings. So if we made a change to login.defs, we would not see that applied to any existing account. And we'd have to go in with something like the chage command to adjust anybody that already existed on the machine. All right. So our last most important user thing to do is creating shared file areas for users.
Yeah. This one can be intimidating at first, right? Just because permissions on Linux can be intimidating, but fear not.
Yeah, so there's like a whole bunch of stuff that you do as root to like set up the structure for these users to be able to share files. And then on RHEL 9, there's a thing that you'll have to do at the user level to make sure that the default permissions that they're using will help them with this sharing of content. So the first thing we're going to do is when users want to share files with one another, they can do it natively, right? Like you could take that file and you could put it in the temp directory where everyone on the entire system has access. But the problem is you're taking a file and you're putting it where everyone has access. So it
Not to
might
mention some systems have policies that periodically clean out temp, so you don't want to leave it there for a while.
right. And so um, if you know that people are going to want to share files, maybe they work in the same department, maybe they're working on a project together, you create a space for that, right? So I'm just going to create opt research. Um, the next thing you want to do is you want to put the users into a group that they all share together, right? So because I'm creating this file for research, I'm going to go ahead and create the research group. And then I'm going to add Frank to it.
And the system will automatically pick a group ID if you don't specify one. Scott's probably doing this just so that it's easy to remember later.
I'm actually doing it even more importantly than that.
Oh, okay.
So
Then I'll be quiet.
yeah, so if we look at Frank's entry in Etsy password, oh, we can see it's already happened. So you see how Frank's user ID number is 1006 and his group ID number is 1007?
Mm-hmm.
What that tells me is that somebody added a group to this machine and they did not specify a group ID for it. And now my user IDs and group IDs are out of sync.
Ah, and that bothers you.
It does. Typically, well, because if you look at Frank, when Frank creates files, they're owned by the Frank user and a private group also
Mm-hmm.
named Frank. And if those two ID numbers are identical, it means I only have to remember one number when I'm working with Frank.
Right.
But now thanks to my things getting out of sync, I have to remember two numbers when I work with Frank. I have to remember his user ID number and his group ID number, which means I probably have to look up one or the other or both.
Right.
So the reason that I added the research group as group ID 10,000 is it sets this like group that I know is going to be extra to the system way up here in the group IDs. And so the next time I add a user, they're going to grab the next available user ID and the next available group ID. And as long as I have less than 9,000 users,
Yeah.
uh, that's
9,993.
yeah, that's not going to conflict with this research group that I put up at GID 10,000.
Yeah.
The other thing is that when I look at groups on the machine, if they're not matching a username, I have a pretty good idea what their group ID is going to be like, right? Because are you going to have 800,000 group IDs? Probably not, right? You'll have like 20 or 50 or 100. And
Right.
if you put them at 10,000, then you expect them to all be in that range. So
Right.
that's just you know, Scott McBrien, been doing this for a long time. Let me share my secret nuggets of wisdom with you.
There you go.
All
But
right.
it will assign one, but it'll just get you into the thing, into the scenario that Scott just described. So, which was my only point. You don't necessarily have to define one, but it's good practice. Good practice, according to Scott.
All right. So you can see here when I did that user mod, adding Frank to the research group, he now belongs to the research group. Cool. I want to go over to this opt research directory and make a couple of property changes to it. All right, so when I originally created it, it was owned by root and the root group. So I'm using the chgrp command to change the group owner to the research group for this directory. Right, so now people who are in the research group can access it with the group owner permissions. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mess with those permissions a little bit. All right. So permissions, there's like a whole into the terminal article episode on permissions. But I did two things. One is I set the normal file permissions to 770, meaning that the owner, root, has read, write, execute permission on this group. The research group has read, write, execute permissions on this directory. And then 0, others have nothing else. So if you're not root or in the research group, you don't even get to look in this directory to see what's there. The other thing I did was I added a special permission. That's what that leading to is for. I added the sgid permission, set group ID permission. And so when people put things in this directory, they will be automatically owned by the research group rather than their default group on the system.
Right.
So that's why we set those permissions. All right, so at this point, the root pieces of things have been done. Created a group for my users who want to share files to have in common. I created a directory and set the ownerships and permissions on that directory to support people in that group being able to trade files with one another outside of publicly available spaces. And the last thing I need to do is a change to Frank. Okay. So as it stands right now, when Frank creates a file, it is owned by him and his private group, and it gets permissioned so that he has read and write permission, and people in the group have read permission only, others have read permission only. And this is controlled by a setting called the umask.
Which stands for user mask, by the way, if anyone's curious.
Yeah. And essentially umask is it subtracts away permissions from the default permission someone can create files or directories with. And what this umask does is subtracts away the write permission from groups and others. So write permission has an octal value of 2. So when we take the default file and directory permissions and then we subtract off the things in the umask, we end up with are the default file permissions that files get created with. So the last thing I want to change at the Frank level is I want to change this umask. So I'm still going to subtract write permissions away from others, but I'm going to grant write permissions by default to our group. Right, so here's the file I just created after I changed the umask. And you can see that the group now by default gets write permissions. But by using the umask command, I made a one-time change. So when Frank logs
Right.
out, the session, it goes back to normal again, which isn't going to help us with our research group. So I'm going to make this a permanent change by adding it to Frank's bash RC in his home directory. Now, every time Frank logs in, he sets that umask because one of the login scripts that gets executed when Frank logs in is this bash RC, which is for running commands at login time. And this umask command gets re-executed to reestablish his default umask. So if I exit my session and log back in as Frank, right, we can see that my preferred umask is the one that's stuck around. All right, so now when Frank goes over to opt research, when he creates a file in this place, it is owned by the research group, thanks to the sgid permission I put on as root. And thanks to my adjustment to Frank's umask, that group gets write access. So other people who belong to the research group can edit this file that Frank has put in this directory. They could also put files in the Frank directory that Frank created here. And if they create their own subdirectory structure, it'll be owned by the research group. And if they've changed their umask, then Frank would have reciprocal access to their files and directories.
Right. Now, it is worth mentioning because people watching this might say, what about file system ACLs? File system ACLs are a way to get a lot more complicated with how these permissions are applied. They use like file system permissions masks that work sort of in the same way as umask, but I guess they could work via number as well as the same way umask does. But they get really complicated really quick, and you can really easily make a mask that makes the file system behave, not the file system, but makes the file system permissions behave in a way that is not obvious, right? So just keep that in mind that if you have a more complicated situation, you may have to look into ACLs, file system ACLs. It's actually an extended attribute you have to add when you mount the file system, unless that's changed in RHEL 9. I don't think it has. But there's an ACL flag you have to add as a mount option that turns them on. Otherwise, they're off by default. I used to work in a place where we had a really crazy, complicated Samba file sharing setup that used ACLs all over the place because we had users like all kinds of different permissions. Just simple group ownership wasn't enough. And it was so easy to mess up that we had written wrapper scripts and a database. You made changes to the database that said these people have these permissions, and the scripts made it happen because it was too easy for an administrator that was just changing them to totally hose it. So just keep that in mind.
I mean, what's the KISS principle, Nate?
Right. Keep it simple.
Keep it simple,
Silly.
silly. All right. I see Mr. Rick Green is talking about um, creating specific group IDs and having a specific range for group IDs. He highlights that NFS would be another reason why it's important to do that. So if you have the same group IDs defined on every system, um, when you're using things like NFS, where the ID number is what's transferred by the file system, and we still have to look that up to figure out what the ID number relates to in terms of group name, you can keep that identical across all of your systems. So yeah, same thing with user IDs, by the way. If you have a user across multiple systems and you're individually managing them, you'll want to make sure that their ID number across all those systems is the same. One of the benefits of having a central user repository is
Yep.
then you just one place.
There's a reason most books that talk about how to set up NFS also talked about NIS, because you could share identity across systems using NIS back in the day. Now there's better ways to get it done.
Yeah, in fact, I think we have finally removed NIS from things. I know it's been deprecated for a long time, um, and instead something like LDAP or Identity Manager, which also uses LDAP, would be the way to go there.
Right.
All right, so
All
Nate,
right. So this has been a fun trip down user management. Folks, if you think we got anything wrong, or if you have any other tips, feel free to comment. We'd love to hear. Because, like I said, there's like a million ways to do anything on Linux.
indeed. Uh, Tune in next week. We'll be covering another of our top 5. Um, Nate and I will actually have to put in some work on this one because it'll be interesting. Top 5 ways to identify your Linux system may be having problems. So we'll have to figure out how to make systems that are broken so that we can show you what that looks like.
They're always fun episodes. So yeah, if you're ever wondering what should I watch on my Linux systems, what should I monitor, what should I make things that my monitoring system can watch, it's a good episode to tune into, or it should be.
We'll see.
Yeah.
And then in 2 weeks, RHEL Presents will be doing event-driven infrastructure with Ansible. So you can join Eric and Brian as they talk to some friends in the Ansible team here at Red Hat about event-driven infrastructure with Ansible. Till next week, Nate, any last parting words of wisdom?
That Frank guy. Careful. Careful with Frank.
I would say document what your user management policies are, right? Have
Yeah.
a written policy for how we handle different events that happen, because then you'll have to apply it. And you want to do it all consistently, the same way.
Yeah, and repeatably, so that you're not the only person that remembers how it's done. So that if you're on vacation or you leave the company, uh, people aren't left scrambling.
Yep. All right. Until next week, everyone. Happy end of the terminaling.
Have a good one.